Hello, I'm Nigel Warburton, and this is a podcast of my book, Philosophy the Classics. Further details of this book and others I've written are available at www.virtualphilosopher.org. John Locke, an essay concerning human understanding. Is a newborn's mind a blank slate, or do we come into the world armed with knowledge? John Locke addressed these questions in his essay concerning human understanding. His answer was that all our knowledge is derived ultimately from the information we receive from the five senses. We come into this world knowing nothing whatsoever. Experience teaches us everything we know. This view is usually known as empiricism, and is contrasted with innatism, the theory that some of our knowledge is inborn, and rationalism, the contention that we can achieve knowledge of the world by the power of reason alone. There was lively debate about the origins of our knowledge when Locke was writing in the 17th century, and this has continued in a somewhat altered form to the present day. Locke's essay, published in 1689, soon became a philosophical bestseller. He produced 4 editions of it in his lifetime, and it had already reached its 11th by 1735. It's a complex and wide-ranging work. Its main focus is the origin and limits of human knowledge. What can we know, and what is the relation between thought and reality? These are the perennial questions of the branch of philosophy called epistemology, or theory of knowledge. Locke's answer to them had a lasting influence on the course of the subject, and many great philosophers, including Berkeley and Leibniz, defined their own positions in relation to them. Locke described his role as that of an under-labourer, clearing away conceptual confusions so that the scientists, or natural philosophers as they were then known, could carry on their important work of adding to human knowledge. This slightly self-deprecatory remark shouldn't blind us to the difficulty of the task which Locke set himself, which was nothing less than to explain the origins and nature of human knowledge. This involved a rejection of a whole tradition which had been built on the assumption that whatever was written by an authority, such as Aristotle, must be true. Locke took great pleasure in overthrowing received opinion and replacing it with reasoned hypothesis. His aim was to shed light on what had until then been obscure. His motivation was a love of truth and the exhilaration of thinking for oneself about some of the most profound questions we can ask. He was under no illusion, though, that his would be the last word on any of the topics he discussed, nor was he particularly optimistic about human understanding in general. He believed that God had given us the wherewithal to achieve knowledge of God, our moral duty, and of whatever was necessary to get through life, but that ultimately the powers of reason were very limited. No innate principles. Many 17th century philosophers believed in the existence of God-given innate principles, that is, principles that every human being is born knowing. These might be either what Locke called speculative principles, such as the obviously true statement, whatever is, or else practical principles, such as the moral claim, parents have a duty to look after their children, or everyone ought to keep their promises. Locke used a range of arguments to show that neither sort of principle was innate. Most of these arguments rely on his fundamental assumption that the contents of the human mind are transparent to itself. That is, if you're having a thought, then it must be possible for you to get access to the content of that thought. Locke doesn't believe that it makes any sense to say that someone could be having a thought without their knowing what that thought was about. He rejects any notion of unconscious thoughts as nonsensical. One argument he uses to support his claim that there are no innate principles is that it is obvious that there is not total agreement about what the supposedly innate principles might be. If we were all born knowing that, for example, we should keep our promises, then everyone would recognise this as a fundamental principle. But, as Locke points out, there is no such general agreement. Some people see no obligation whatsoever to keep their promises, nor do children immediately recognise the principle as one that is binding on them. Rather, the principle is one that has to be taught and learnt. The same holds for any principle you care to examine, moral or otherwise. Furthermore, we would expect the supposedly innate principles to be more evident in children than in adults, because children would have been less affected by the local customs and would have had less experience of the world. The innate principles should be clearly recognisable in them, but they aren't. The idea that there are innate moral principles shared by all human beings is for Locke a complete non-starter, since a glimpse at history reveals the immense diversity of moral principles that have been held by societies and individuals. It's simply implausible to think that this would result from identical principles implanted in everyone's mind. These and other arguments lead Locke to reject the view that there are any innate principles. However, this leaves him with the task of explaining how it is that the human mind comes to be furnished with thoughts, beliefs, and knowledge of the world. His answer is that all our ideas come from experience. Ideas. Locke uses the word idea to mean whatever it is that anyone thinks about. When you look out of your window, what you see, a tree perhaps or a sparrow, is not the tree or sparrow itself, but rather a representation of it, an idea, something like a picture in your head. What you see isn't just a product of what is out there in the world, but it's also in part a creation of your sensory system. But not all our ideas are received from immediate sensation of the world. Some of them are ideas of reflection, such as when we reason or remember or will something. Locke believes that all our ideas ultimately come from experience, so that the contents of our thoughts, even when we're reflecting rather than perceiving, all come from sensation. A child locked away from the world, who had only had sensations of black and white, would have no more idea of scarlet and green than he would of the taste of oysters or pineapple if he'd never tried them. Ideas can be combined in various ways, so that once we have the idea of scarlet and the idea of a coat, we can imagine a scarlet coat, even if we've never actually seen one. But the simpler ideas from which the complex ones are built all originate in perception by one or more of the five senses. Primary and secondary qualities. When we say that a snowball is greyish-white and cold and round, what we mean is that it can produce in us ideas of these properties. Locke distinguishes primary and secondary qualities, giving a very different account of each. Primary qualities are inseparable from objects. The primary qualities of a snowball would include its shape and solidity, but not its colour or its coldness. Here Locke was very much influenced by the science of his day, and in particular by the corpuscularian hypothesis put forward by Robert Boyle. Boyle suggested that all matter is composed of minute particles or corpuscles, which are grouped together in various ways. A single corpuscle alone in the universe would still possess the primary qualities of shape, size, and solidity. The ideas that we have of an object's primary qualities, Locke believes, resemble those qualities. So, for example, if a snowball has the primary qualities of roundness and a certain size, then the ideas we have of these features resemble these aspects of the actual snowball. They are accurate representations of these qualities. Secondary qualities are powers to produce ideas, but secondary qualities do not resemble their objects. They are rather a consequence of the texture of corpuscles out of which the objects are composed, of the particular conditions under which they are perceived, and of the sensory system of the perceiver. Secondary qualities, unlike primary ones, aren't properties that the corpuscles themselves have independently of observers. Take colour, for instance. Colour is a secondary quality. So what this means is that the actual snowball doesn't really have colour in the sense that it has shape and size. I have an idea of the snowball as greyish-white. However, under different lighting conditions, it might appear to be a completely different colour, blue for instance. But in this case, the blueness would no more be in the snowball than is the grey-white colour. The colour of the snowball derives from the arrangement of the corpuscles, its microstructure if you like. The primary qualities of the corpuscles give rise to my ideas of it. The same is true of the snowball's coldness and its taste. These are not strictly properties found in the snowball, but rather secondary qualities of the object dependent on its primary qualities. Locke's discussion of primary and secondary qualities makes clear his realism, his unquestioned belief in the existence of real objects in the external world. This may just sound like common sense, but some philosophers then, and some before and since, have been led to sceptical views about the nature of whatever it is that causes our experience. Personal identity. One part of Locke's essay which has set the framework for most subsequent discussion on the topic, and continues to exert an influence, is the chapter Identity and Diversity. This was only added to the work in the second edition. It contains a discussion of the problem of personal identity, the question of what it is that makes someone the same person after a period of time in which they may have changed quite significantly, both bodily and psychologically. Locke's answer to this question involves a discussion of three separate but related questions. 1. What constitutes sameness of substance? 2. What makes someone at a later date the same man? And finally 3. what makes someone at a later date the same person? We would say that we were dealing with the same substance if none of the particles of which an object is composed have changed or been removed. Clearly, with a living organism, this never occurs, since at least at a microscopic level, parts are continually being lost and renewed. So sameness of physical substance won't be a useful criterion for determining personal identity over time, since no living human being ever maintains precisely the same physical constituents from moment to moment. For Locke, man is a particular biological organism, a member of the species we call Homo sapiens. A man is like an oak tree or a horse in this respect. A huge spreading oak tree is still the same oak it was 20 years ago, despite having doubled in size and shed its leaves 20 times. It's not the same substance, but it's the same oak, in virtue of the continued function of its living parts. In the same way, I'm the same man I was 10 years ago, despite physical and psychological changes. Part of Locke's originality on this topic lay in separating questions about the identity of a man from those of a man's personal identity. But what exactly is a person if it's not the same as a man? According to Locke, a person is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself, as itself, the same thinking thing in different times and places. In other words, a person isn't simply a member of our species, since some human beings lack the power of reason and of self-consciousness. Furthermore, in principle, some non-human creatures could be considered persons. Locke cites a report of a rational parrot that was allegedly able to answer quite detailed questions in a convincing way. He points out that we would be unlikely to call it a man, despite its intelligence. It would always be a rational parrot, but it might also be considered a person if it had the appropriate level of rationality and self-consciousness. What then, according to Locke, is the criterion of personal identity over time? It can't be simply bodily continuity, since that does not guarantee us that we are dealing with the same person. Rather, personal identity stretches only so far as consciousness will stretch. Memory and continuing recognition of being responsible for one's past actions are the conditions of personal identity. No matter how much I've changed physically, if I can remember my past actions as my own, then I am the same person that I was. Locke explains this notion with a thought experiment. Imagine that one day a prince wakes up to find that he has all the memories of a cobbler and none of his own. His body remains unchanged. On the same morning, a cobbler wakes up to find that he has all the prince's memories. Locke maintains that although the prince-bodied individual remains the same man, he's not the same person that he was when he went to sleep. It wouldn't be fair to hold the prince-bodied person responsible for the prince's former actions, since he wouldn't have any recollection of having performed them. This far-fetched example is intended to bring out the important difference between the terms man and person. But where does that leave us with cases of memory loss? It seems that on Locke's account, we shouldn't ever punish people for what they can't remember doing, since in an important sense, they would not be the same person who committed the misdemeanours. Person, for Locke, is a forensic term, by which he means that it's one which is particularly relevant to legal questions relating to responsibility for one's actions. It would seem then that we should never punish a murderer who can't remember killing. Locke's view on this is that in cases of memory loss or alleged memory loss, we tend to assume that if we have identified the man who performed the actions, then this must be the same person who committed them. We punish drunks for their actions, even if they claim not to be able to remember what they did. However, this is simply a result of the difficulty of anyone proving their ignorance of what they did. The law has to be practical, and so rarely accepts memory loss as an excuse. However, Locke suggests, on the day of judgment, God will not hold anyone responsible for actions which they can't remember performing. Language. Locke is interested both in the nature of language and in its use in effective communication. Language for him is not simply a matter of making intelligible sounds. Parrots, even non-rational ones, can do that. Rather, words are signs of ideas. They signify them. Because words are signs for ideas, and all our ideas come from experience, all our language and thought using language is intimately connected with our experience. By using words, we can communicate our thoughts to others, as I hope I'm doing to you now. But Locke believes that we don't necessarily all attach the same ideas to the same words. For instance, my particular associations for the word albatross may be very different from yours. on account of our very different experience of individual albatrosses. You may have had no experience directly of an albatross, and yet feel confident in using the word. The idea you have associated with the word will be very different from the idea held by someone who saw albatrosses on a daily basis. If you have no clear idea of an albatross, you may just end up making sounds just as a parrot does when it's been taught to mimic, or as a young child does. So, although words are uttered in public, what they signify can still be private and idiosyncratic, and this can be a source of confusion and misunderstanding. There are far fewer nouns than there are things to which they refer. If there were a name for every particular thing, it would be impossible to communicate effectively. We use the general word albatross to refer to a whole species of bird. Locke maintains that we acquire such general words on the basis of abstracting from our particular experiences. Criticisms of an essay concerning human understanding. Innate knowledge. In the 20th century, research by the linguist Noam Chomsky resurrected the debate about innate knowledge. From close analysis of the sentences used by children when learning to speak, he concluded that the best explanation for the universally shared grammatical structures of different languages and the patterns of children's grammatical mistakes was an innate framework for interpreting and using language that all children are born with, what he called a language acquisition device. This provides a serious challenge to Locke's belief that a newborn's mind is like a blank piece of paper waiting to be written on by experience. It is much closer to Leibniz's belief that the mind is like a block of marble which has various fault lines along which it is predisposed to break to reveal a well-designed sculpture. Do ideas of primary qualities resemble their objects? Locke's account of the distinction between primary and secondary qualities sounds plausible at first reading, and is lent support by the various sensory illusions that suggest that secondary qualities are qualities of objects as they appear to us, rather than actually being somehow in the objects themselves. However, as Berkeley pointed out, Locke's claim that ideas of primary qualities resemble the objects is ultimately unsupportable. On Locke's account, objects as they really are hidden behind a veil of perception. We only get direct access to ideas, not what those ideas are ideas of. So for Locke to maintain that ideas of primary qualities resemble their objects is nonsensical. In order to ascertain whether one thing resembles another, we need access to both of them. But on Locke's account of the mind, we only ever have access to one side, our own ideas. Berkeley went even further than this, arguing that because, strictly speaking, we only have access to the contents of our own minds, we can't even prove the existence of anything independently of the mind. Locke, in contrast, simply assumes that the mind could not produce our ideas without there being an external world. The homunculus problem. Locke's account of ideas makes them very like pictures in the head, but this doesn't really explain much about the processes of thought, because in order to appreciate what a picture is of, it seems to require a little person, a homunculus, inside your head to interpret that picture, and then one inside his head, and so on. This infinite series of homunculi, apparently implied by his account of the mind, is clearly an unacceptable consequence. It suggests that there is something wrong with Locke's account. Memory loss doesn't always sever personal identity. The philosopher Thomas Reid, writing in the 18th century, countered Locke's claim that memory provides an adequate criterion of personal identity by using the following example. Imagine a brave officer who was once flogged at school for stealing from an orchard. In his first campaign as a young soldier, he succeeded in capturing a standard from the enemy. When he captured the standard, he could remember that he'd been flogged as a boy. Later he was made a general, but by that time, although he could remember capturing the standard, he could no longer remember being flogged at school. The person who captured the standard is, on Locke's account, the same person who was flogged, because of the memory link. Similarly, the memory link makes the general the same person as the young officer who captured the standard. Logic seems to tell us that if the boy is the same person as the young officer, and the officer the same person as the old general, then the boy must be the same person as the old general. Locke, however, would have to deny this on the grounds that the old general can't remember being flogged, and so this link with the past is severed. Reid's point is that this is a logical absurdity because Locke's account gives us two contradictory conclusions, both that the boy and the general are the same person and that they are not. Any theory which leads to such an obvious contradiction must be false. Locke's response to this sort of criticism would have to be that the boy and the general are the same man, but not the same person, and that it would be wrong to hold the general responsible for what the boy did. Locke would have to deny that the pattern of overlapping memories described by Reid leads to the conclusion that the boy is the same person as the general.